Welcome to the webinar. I'll give a little bit of introduction about today's topic. A recent report by the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and the Ecosystem Services warns of the introduction of more than 37,000 invasive species across marine, aquatic, and terrestrial ecosystems. And more than 3,500 of the species have been found to be harmful and threatening to the survival of ecosystems and affecting human health and livelihoods. And aquatic systems are particularly at risk from invasive species due to threats to biodiversity and critical human need for the water resources. And in today's webinar, we will dive into this troubled waters of aquatic ecosystems, and we will focus mainly on invasives here. And with this, I will introduce our speakers. We have Dr. Marco Milardi. He is a science officer at COFA, the Southern Indian Ocean Fisheries Agreement. Dr. Milardi is deeply engaged in fascinating world of aquatic ecology, dedicating his research to understanding the intricate relationship between various fish species and the environment. And with a keen interest in broader scope of marine species and international environmental management, he continually explores new dimensions of aquatic life, striving to enhance our understanding and management of these vital systems. And our second speaker is Dr. Umpathy. He is a chief scientist at the Center for Cell and Molecular Biology. And Dr. Umpathy is involved in research on understanding habitat fragmentation and its effects on survival of endangered species in human-dominated landscapes. And that is how this is connected to our topic as well, because as we are as we have entered the Anthropocene, the waters are also no more not human dominated landscapes. So his group has developed various biotechnological tools for biodiversity conservation, including eDNA tools in aquatic ecosystems to study environmental species, ecosystem services, and invasive species. So with this, I would like to start the conversation uh, and throw a question towards both Marco and Dr. Umpathy, that biotic interchanges and paleo invasions contributed to biodiversity as we know it. It has been going over for millions of years. So how is the current global invasion different from that? Uh, Marco, would you like to go first?
Okay, thanks, Shreya, and hello to everyone. I hope you can hear me well. My take on this one is that the main difference is about speed and intensity. Before, of course, human groups moved across regions of space, and of course, they could bring species even like very long distances. If you think of, I don't know, some of the carps that were transported from China to Europe. But right now we have like much more capabilities of transporting those species faster, longer distances, and more. There are also like new novel pathways for the transport of species that did not exist before. One of the many is ballast water, which is of course like came to be with modern shipping and like a different system to ballast and balance the ships. So I think that there is like a whole set of new mechanisms, and there's a whole new gear to this process that is very clear in both the literature and such, and of course in our day-to-day experience. That said, of course, we have also been more aware of this phenomenon, and that of course allows us to detect it a bit more. Which we were not before. This is quite recent. Until the 70s, more or less, of the last century, we still thought of some of these things in a very different way. And I think the mindset allows us to see them more and see them in a different way now than we did like only 50 years ago. I hope this helps, and I'm glad to leave the floor to my colleague.
Yeah, I think now people move across the places not only by what he was mentioning, ballastic water, but also accidentally also get introduced. Somebody purposely get introduced, somebody non-purposely get introduced, like accidentally. But there are people also use for purpose like ornamental purposes, even sometime even trading people use. The pet they'll use. So people started even buying some fishes which are fancy some part of the world, bring here personally to the other part of the world. This is TT, unlike another wild animal, like IUCN has some endangered species, TT is there, CITES is there, where some scheduled species, endangered species are banned to ship to one location to another locations. And when it comes to fishes, aquatic organism, except endangered species, any other species which are fancy can be, brought any part of the world and without much conditions, rules and regulation per local countries. That's the reason you find lot of them. As you mentioned, there are hundreds of species introduced last hundreds of years now. So it has been now a serious issue, not only ecosystem but everywhere now. So many ways is getting introduced, purposefully, accidentally, knowingly, also trading way they get introduced. Yeah.
Right. So I will follow up that question, the last question with, has it become easier to determine invasive species with eDNA technology that you have been working on? As we know that uh, with the humans and trade and different kind of pathways that comes with people, invasive species have become more common. So we also need to be able to detect them as fast as we can. So how do you think it is different from like earlier ways that people used to detect?
Yeah. The earlier people used to detect any species, aquatic species, by using classical method where they go and catch, use net, hook. There are many, conventional method, but it is possible for 1 pond, 2 ponds, 1 lakh, 2 lakh, 3 lakh possible. When large scale landscape, such a methodology take years after year. So it's not possible to do the conventional method to detect them and wait them to come summertime to catch them and find out. But the eDNA promising tool which can be very much useful by using DNA primer code, which can be freely available in the water as all the aquatic animal plants sheds the DNA in the water. So that can be targeted, and it's throughout year it go on shed, and it varies depending on species and season and temperature. All those factors are involved, but the DNA is freely available in the water. So collecting the water, extracting the DNA from the water sources, one can easily detect any species. It can be a elusive species, it can be a low abundant species, very well possible because even few copy numbers in the in a 10-liter water can also be detected. Such a accurate measure is available now to using no use to detect species. In fact, we were very successful doing first time in India, where almost more than um, entire Eastern Ghats, entire Eastern for that matter, it's a mountain ranges, covers Tamil Nadu, Andhra Pradesh, Telangana, Orissa, West Bengal. There are 4 5 states covers Eastern Ghat. Within 4 months of time, we were able to collect samples across Eastern Ghats. More than 200 to 300 samples we collected, all the places to detect a species by only 10 ml of water, 100 ml of water, like that. So you take a vehicle, go and collect sample, come back in the lab. We could do it within 6 months. Enter Eastern Guard, I could able to detect a particular species. For example, we did African catfish. One of the best example we used. In fact, 2 3 species we did. One example where within 3 months, enter Eastern Guard, all the aquatic wetlands, important wetlands, endemic species wetland, many fish endemic species wetlands covered within 3 4 months to collect samples, and it took only 3 months to analyze in the lab. So within 6 months, the large sets, landscape area we could cover by the eDNA. So such a powerful tool that can help to shorten our time period to monitor, assess, also accurately we can do it. So it in a become powerful tool to this kind of detecting species. It can be a entire biodiversity, it can be a single species.
I see. Just a little follow-up question on that. Can we get an idea of how abundant a species is based on the amount of eDNA that you find in the water sample?
So it is possible, relative abundance possible very well. There are works going on not only India or outside. We did some experiment. It has a lot of error actually because it influenced by various factors, season, size of the species, and also possibly the bioclimate condition of the particular system. So, but at a given time, given season, at a time, if you want screenshot, you want to take it, it is possible. But you can only say relative abundance. For example, X leg has this many copy number, Y leg has this many copy number, Z leg is this many copy number. So based on that, we can relatively measure that is so low, high, low, like that. But there are experiments already going on outside India. People able to even detect abundance by estimation by running in-house laboratory experiment, particular species, how many copy number released per day in adult fish. So based on that, simulation can be taken out. That can be worked out to in a real-time condition where X species, this many copy number, that means this many species possibly percent there.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So, uh, also, the next question I have is for Marco. So, we know that there are invasive species, but how do these introduced species affect other species based on your research?
Thanks for the question. It's very complex, and I think we're always finding some new nuances to this question. But to give you like a very basic overview, one of the classic ways that people imagine this is, of course, that the new species will eat some of the species that are native. It's a very classic example, and it's, of course, very apparent, but it's not always the case. The other classic example people think of is that the new species will compete ecologically with the native species, and most of the cases outcompete the native species. And these are like, I think, the two most visible and more studied effects of invasive species, because they're basically just easier to study and see. There are other ways that the species interact that are a bit more subtle and a bit harder to detect and measure. And one of them is hybridization. So hybridization is when the new species is not so far from a native species and they can interbreed, which obviously puts at risk the genetic pool of the native species. Another one that has been studied, but it's not as visible, is when an exotic species, an introduced species, is resistant to some parasites and disease, but the native species isn't. Therefore, like there's a transmission of parasites and diseases. And this is obviously something that has been challenging, but also quite well studied. It's just that the community of parasitologists or disease people are very specialized, and their work are not very well known to the public. This has been as well like very focused on aquaculture purpose rather than like necessarily on nature, with some exceptional examples, of course. The last but not least is I think the habitat modification capabilities, which I find some of the most fascinating, but I understand are the most hard to study because of they do introduce a host of changes, and you might have to utilize very different techniques, sampling on the field and analysis techniques to detect these kind of changes. Sometimes they are very apparent changes, but it's also quite difficult to tie them specifically to one of the species. So it might require experimental setups, sometimes like wall lake or mesocosm setups to prove some of these interactions. But I find it like the most fascinating because they are the most profound, if you want, changes. They do change the environment for all of the species, and therefore they can have, it's not like competition or predation with one or two different species, but it's like it really changes the game for all the native species and the exotic species alike, of course. And last but not least, I want to stress that one of these mechanisms doesn't exclude the other. So when there is a species that is, clearly, for example, like its main impact is predation, that doesn't exclude that there is a competition as well, or that there is no disease transmission, or that there is no hybridization. Of course, these can act at the same time and can have synergistic effects. To add complication, each of these species will have their own set of interactions. So each of the introduced species has their own, and they interact with each other as much as they interact with the native species. So I think it adds to the complex challenge of like trying to disentangle and measure these factors when like trying to study this phenomenon. I hope this helps. Thanks.
Yes, definitely. And also, I remember reading one of your paper where you have worked on where you have found that uh, like it also affect birds, like as in like it's a bottom-up process where it is not in the aquatic space anymore. It is also affecting other species in the system. So, could you also let us know about that work a little bit?
Sure. Just like part of my work has been around the linkages from the terrestrial and the aquatic environment. So many people think of again, like there's a lot of people tend to think of fish species because they're specialized on a certain species or a certain type of study as like an isolated case. But if you use a wider lens, you realize that there are all these interaction in the aquatic environment, but also that there is a linkage between the terrestrial environment and the aquatic environment. And that linkage as well can be affected by the exotic species. And in that case that you mentioned in your question, we observed that introduced fish were actually able to predate on birds, which is not something that is uncommon. It's a lot of fish actually will eat birds, especially, young birds if they have a chance to. But because of the increased presence of these species that was not there before, some natural areas for the conservation of birds turn from a potential source of birds because they are protected and therefore they can reproduce and therefore they can replenish the general population to potentially sinks of birds, because birds are attracted to a safe place to raise their chicks. But that safe place is only safe from hunting and from other human pressures, and it's not safe from predation by the invasive species. So I think there was like one of those cases where we try to show that there is predation on the terrestrial environment. I have made several studies also with trouts on the linkages between terrestrial and the aquatic environment, and how basically introducing new species does change this linkage and transports nutrient and like changes the way that the ecosystem dynamics actually work at a larger scale than previously thought. So every time people say that I focus a lot on, of course, on the negative effects, but I know that we'll talk about maybe some positive effects as well of this. But this is our job in a way. It's like to measure and estimate and quantify what are these interactions, where they're going, how relevant they are, and no matter whether a judgment of qualitative, like is it better or worse to have a higher linkage to the aquatic environment and the terrestrial environment. There's no real answer to this kind of question. but we just measure and like estimate what that linkage is and how it has changed. And likewise, with birds, of course, how these are affected by, a new dynamic on the water that wasn't there before. I hope this kind of answers your question. Thanks.
Definitely. I think this also opens for a new way of looking at biodiversity conservation. And also, my next question is to Dr. Umpathy. So we know that these fishes are existing, or the species are existing in the aquatic water bodies. And I remember attending your session in the IWIC. We had a conference called International Indian Wildlife Ecology Conference, where I first came across Dr. Umpathy's work. So I remember that you have in your lab you have worked on how like how species have traveled from different areas. We can identify, yes, the species is here, but you also have been able to understand where the species has originated from and how it has traveled. So I would request you to let us know about how your
Yeah.
findings from that.
Yeah. So invasive species actually spreads two ways. One is naturally spreads. Other one is by man-made. By one location they may be introduced later on. It became naturally spreads. Other way is like every time people introduced to the different location. For example, this particular catfish originally introduced in north eastern part of India, where West Bengal and near place where it was introduced as part of a breeding program with Indian catfish. But they failed to breed this particular species. But what happened that got introduced locally. Then later on, people thought that the fish is growing faster and quicker and giving a lot of meat, and also started taking out and people putting elsewhere. Like from now it is from Kanyakumari to Kashmir, every place in Punjab, we almost 90 places from all 30 states we found. Everywhere this fish is there now. So now look like it is not naturally spread. It's basically spread by introducing manually by people. So how did we know? We know we collected a DNA sample of all the species and worked on the haplotypes. Means who is relative to whom, how closely, because the haplotypes analysis can help to understand how the two individual populations are different or similar. Based on that, we can matching their genetic makeup and we'll able to tell that Telangana fish is very close related to Andhra Pradesh, but very far from Karnataka, something like that. So based on that route, we can estimate. Then we can also, based on mutation it happened, we can also mention that originally where it is introduced. For example, our entire this population came from North Africa, one particular region, Nile region, where a particular group of population. In there are Nile, there are many, that region, there are many such population. There are some 15-20 population, sub-population were there. One of the population, few fishes were brought to India. From that, it spread to India last 30, 40 years. When we matched all the genetic codes and we were able to match it with all the many subpopulation Africa has, only one particular population has been introduced to India. That is spread to India across. And we are also monitoring now where it start from. But we could find only, because 30, 40 years, the mutation not that much, we could detect from only one location, single mutation only we could find. Otherwise, not much subpopulation we could to find out. So essentially, among the 30, 20 subpopulation of African countries, one particular population, it came here, not many of them, only one location, it came to India. From that, it spread by actually officially you can say people are spread by human by want to culture them for some other purpose. It has been now everywhere now. So you can use a genetic mutation as well as haplotype analysis. We'll be able to trace them, where they come from, who is the relative, how far they relative, and how old each other also possible. It's 30, 40 years very difficult to analyze, but otherwise 100 years, 500 years, 1000 years possibly too.
I see. Yeah. So, yeah, it also has implications on conservation, on who maybe, which group of people, where do we go about doing awareness if we want to do awareness kind programs for and targeted to control invasive species. So, yeah, so um, also the next question is to Marco. So it is, could freshwater fish introduction have caused long-lasting changes in nutrient dynamics that are exported downstream to areas where the fish is not present at all? And could you tell us more about your study in the on the introduced grass carp in Fodi Volano Basin?
Of course. This is a very special species, but it's not the only one that might have this effect. Just for those of you that are not super familiar with the species, it's one of the few exclusively vegetarian fishes. Well, mostly exclusively, none of them is really exclusive. But they have their mouth is like a cow. They really are made to eat grass and vegetation. So the dynamics of these species are very simple. They will grow very fast. In the first years, they will eat a lot, and then they will slow down, and they will reproduce, and they will reach a certain level of density. And with lower level of density of the population, they will just keep on grazing the algal, mostly the microphyte, actually, production in freshwaters. Without like particular effect. If you think about primary production in freshwaters is enormous. Normally the waters are rich in nutrients and they will produce a lot of biomass, vegetable biomass. However, the problem is that if these species reach a higher concentration and density in water, they're actually able to graze effectively all the plants. Until there are no more plants. And this is more or less what happened in the Fodi Volano Basin, which is like a very good, connection to the case where the Dr. Umpathy was like talking about before, because these fish were actually introduced voluntarily by people, and they were introduced for that specific purpose. I mean, people spent a lot of money to cut the grass in the canals, and they just wanted to get rid of the grass without having to spend money and effort. So they said, well, why don't we put a fish that will do the job for us? They did some experiments. They found out what was the required density. They stocked double the density just to make sure, in case some of them die. And then they just left it at that. What happened in that case was, well, the fish were quite effective. Not many of them died. And they were quite effective. Within 1 or 2 years, there were no plants anymore. So the mission that they were set out to achieve was accomplished. However, that had some consequences. If you think of water bodies as mere ways to transfer water from, let's say, the mountain to the sea, obviously you don't care about anything else. And an hydraulic engineer, that's probably how they did. An ecologist, on the other hand, sees that the rivers and canals and whatever water body serves also an ecological purpose. In this case, the plants that are in the water are the perfect substrate for bacteria to grow, and these bacteria perform a very key function, which is called denitrification. They take all the nutrients in the water and they just, take them out, so to say. They either like trap them in the sediment, or then they are just going to go outside as gases. And this is particularly relevant for nitrogen. Now, the missing this mechanism, what it means that all the nutrients that were before denitrified in the water column are then just transported downstream. And when they get downstream, what we observed in that case was, well, they changed completely the ecosystem of the lagoon, like a brackish lagoon near the sea. So all the water from the river canal went into the lagoon, and before there was a low transport of nutrients, all of a sudden a lot of nutrients went into the lagoon. So then the lagoon was eutrophicated, and had algal blooms and all these other, completely changed the ecosystem of the lagoon. In turn, the lagoon was supporting other human activities. And once again, we started by trying to save some money and time in cutting manually the grass in the canal. And we ended up causing billions of damages downstream to the farming industry, because the species of mussels that were farmed in the lagoon could not survive anymore with the changed condition. So I think it's a very nice case of how sometimes species introduction can have a very big change, which is long lasting. Some of these canals are empty to this day, where the fish have been able to reproduce and are having a density that still maintains their effect. And so they're persisting in time, they're going downstream in space, and in general, they are having unintended consequences. So that's probably also a cautionary tale for us when we think that we know what the effects are going to be, because we know we made some experiments that sometimes there are some consequences we couldn't foresee. I hope it's interesting. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, so a follow-up question to that, as you mentioned that the carp was initially introduced to to basically replace the cutting of grass, which people used to do, which was supposed to save money, but it ended up actually impacting other people in other other sectors such as farming. So there is obviously a socioeconomic angle to it. And from your field experience, what kind of socioeconomic impact is posed by this species, according to you? You already gave one example, but if you have dug deeper into it, then we would like to discuss more.
Sure, and I can make some examples from other areas as well. Look, the thing is that mostly we focus on negative examples, so where these have caused massive economic damage. In freshwaters, the zebra mussel in the Great Lakes is like a small mussel. It grows on boats, for example, and then people have to spend money to clean their boat hulls every year, because the mussel grows so much it actually slows down your navigation. So you have to do that every year. But once again, I want to shift the focus a bit higher up and say that with these invasions, there's always some socioeconomic impacts. Some of them are positive. With fish, I think Dr. Umpathy mentioned, fishermen like to fish something. They eat it, or at least take recreational value. So they will transport it, and they will promote its diffusion. So there are some positive impacts, and some of these species have been introduced exclusively for example, for meat, or for aquaculture, and they have their own place in actually providing positive ecosystem services. Sometimes we haven't introduced them with that intention, but we can try to turn them into something. Blue crabs right now in the Mediterranean are invading, but they're actually good to eat. So we could potentially extract some socioeconomic value out of that invasion by fishing them. And at the same time, that would help the environment. So there are very good cases. But then, of course, again, we tend to focus on the very bad cases. And we tend to use socioeconomic impacts because they're somehow something that we can, or we think that we can measure better than we can measure, for example, on ecological impact, because the loss of a species due to competition is hard to quantify monetarily, but the cost of cleaning your boat hull or doing maintenance on water structures is something, or a farming industry cost is easier to quantify. And that's why we get, some examples of a parasite being introduced with Baltic salmon in Norway, causing the collapse of the Norwegian industry, of salmon farming plus the recreational fisheries in river, and that combined might be a loss of billions. We get this kind of very clear examples. What I think is also overlooked, though, is that there are a myriad of like smaller case examples where it's very hard to see where the social impact was. And for example, a generation of fishermen targeting some species and then switching with a new generation to a different species with a different fishing mode and such. That's a change that is hard to quantify. It might be more subtle. Nobody's ever interested in publishing anything because it will not get you like the flashy titles in the good journals. So I think we are overlooking quite a lot of these more subtle changes, and these are quite important, especially cumulatively changes from the socioeconomic point of view. And we just like are focusing on the bigger and flashier things because, well, they're easy to measure and they're flashier to publish. I hope this helps.
Right. Yeah, probably there is more socio-economic studies which need to be done with to understand what local communities think or people involved with this species are thinking about these introduced species and how it impacts their livelihoods positively or negatively. So yeah, that is definitely an area where we should be working on, I think. And now that we have come towards the part about local communities, I think management plays a very important role, and we have different levels of management. But my next question is to Dr. Umpathy on how these invasive populations can be managed. I have read that some of the species that are invasive in particular area can be endangered in another area. So could you tell us on how to manage these populations based on your experiences?
So this particular fish, which we have data, and there are local governments like Kerala government, for example. These catfish have been asked to catch if, and they also give incentives. So there are places like high endemic areas in Periyar and other places where high endemic species compete. This fish is competing with high endemic species, so it may overtake over a period of time. So there's a fear of this species spreads in very high amount in such a very hotspot biodiversity area, especially aquatic biodiversity area. So there is already management plan they started working on. Especially there's an incentivize to catch them. So every fish, if you catch, there will be some money, and they will remove it from system and destroy it. That's one way of doing it. But it's not happening all the places. These are some places like Kerala Forest Department really actively doing it. But I'm not seeing any other government doing like that. That is a very important step one need to do. And we also plan to work on like a Chinese carp. There are species, how to catch them. That's very important. So it's not easy to capture them because they'll be low abundance sometime. So what we are working on is that anything possible looking for pheromones, like a Chinese carp introduced in US and other places where they use some pheromone to attract them and kill them. Okay, that's possible. So our lab is working on identifying, we have some clue already, we able to find out they have some pheromones that can be concentrated and released in location where this individual can be attracted in location that can be harvested or it can be captured as one possible way of future. Otherwise, as of now, only the fisherman is removing as and when they catch them, but because nobody eats the fish now. So some government doing, not all of them doing. So maybe we need to actually slowly work on this also as well.
I see. So when we, as you pointed out, that government is involved in Kerala and some governments are involved in this. So my next question is to Marco on like who are the stakeholders when it because you have been working in the management side of it as well. So like we know that there are invasives in this these are the invasive species, these are the fishes which are there, this is how they are affecting. So now that we know all this, then how do we identify, or who are the stakeholders who are already established when water bodies are concerned? And how do we spread awareness about invasive species among various groups?
That's, I'm going to try and give an example or examples from my own experience, but obviously these vary quite a lot because there are very specific setups for stakeholders and institutions in different countries. And that's like part of my experience. Look, I think, everyone has a stake and in water bodies, whether it's the sea, the rivers, or a lake, everybody literally has a stake. Water is vital to life, and therefore, like anybody from the common citizen to any kind of water user has a stake. And of course, that includes the government, which is in general like the body that is demanded to take action and manage these things. We'll see, of course, that this doesn't happen most of the times because of lack of resources, not because they're evil, but this is how it happens. So how to identify? Normally, one way that governments or institutions that manage these things have been using is that they call for meetings, to identify stakeholders. They say, look, we are going to look into, let's say, a catfish situation in this area, and we are calling for all the interested groups to, come to the meeting. Many of these will be just citizens, unorganized, and those normally will be represented by the government. They can, of course, write their letters to the government and express their opinions, and the government will, use discretionary judgment into how those are conveyed into a management process. But then there will be other, stakeholders that are going to be a bit more organized: a fishing association, an agricultural association, and, for example, conservation institutions, universities, science stakeholders. So there's a wide variety, and there's no handbook that says which ones they are, because it all depends on like the existence in that one place and their willingness to engage in a certain process. Very large institutions, which I'm sure you have heard about, the WWF or something like that, they don't engage on every single topic or issue. And they don't engage equally at the local level or at the national or international level. So it highly depends on, for example, the extension of the problem, whether it's a local or, let's say, more national or regional problem. It depends a lot on the availability of funding and the direction, for example, from donors for some. And the other part is like, it depends a lot if the category, the stakeholders are actually feeling like they've been touched in first person. So once again, if I am a fish farmer that has been impacted by an invasive species and my economic income has been directly affected, I will be certainly motivated to come, and I will come very strongly to any meeting that decides on the management. If I am like just a citizen and I never even have an idea that below the surface of the water, a lot of things are going on and things are changing, and because I really don't I care only about going to the shopping mall in the weekend. I don't really care about anything else. So I will be much less willing to engage, write letters, or talk with people from the government, whether it's local or regional, to see how I can contribute. I have seen in my experience across the world that a lot of this depends on funds. So funds for, of course, the NGOs to engage, but as well like funds for the government to engage. And therefore, like funding, unfortunately, and as I mentioned earlier at the beginning of my response, resources in general are what is really dictating, who are the stakeholders and how to spread awareness. A lot of the issues I've encountered have actually not been on the radar of the institutions, and because there's just basically no money and no interest, no one in the government interested in following up some of these things. Other issues instead are like prominent because perhaps there's been some maybe even supranational funding or national funding directed to that topic, and all of a sudden it becomes very important and people are willing to engage. They become experts, like they followed it for years. And this is like how life goes. Thanks.
So it depends a lot on the funding also that you are getting, the stakeholders as well. So going ahead, I would like to ask this question to both Marco and Dr. Umpathy. So this is an anecdotal kind of question, and as well as from your research. Are there any interesting observations on aquatic invasive species from your experience, which we would like to share? Like the one thing which you observed during your research, which you think that, oh, okay, wow, I didn't think this could also happen. So, yeah, Dr. Umpathy, would you like to go first?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. In fact, I visited my village, a remote area in Tamil Nadu, east coast of India, southern coast of India, where almost 5 kilometers from my coastal region. To my surprise, our village have 5 ponds and 5 temples like that. Okay, we have village center. So recently, when last year I went, every year in the summer season, they used to collect the fish which is locally available, like marl, all those fishes locally carpenter they collect. This last year, my knowledge, they brought to me in my knowledge that all the fishes they used to collect previously not there now, disappeared, except this catfish. So this is almost 80% catch only for this fish. So this some of the pond do not have even actually proper inlet, river or system, but it has reached such a level. So through some paddy field it would have reached. That's what we assume. So to my surprise, it has reached every nook and corner of our ecosystem, and it will be very alarming. And the way it goes, it is another 10 years or so, we will find only this fish, catfish, every ecosystem. It's somebody written in one newspaper. It's a sitting time bomb kind of thing. So I myself witnessed, although in Hyderabad, all the 10 lakhs which is surveyed, 9 lakh had on this catfish. Entire South India was surveyed except 2 water bodies we found everywhere. Imagine the presence, and they breed so well, more than 10, 15 times any other fishes. Nobody can eat. It can eat anything, everything. Think of their presence everywhere. What will happen next 10 years? Really alarming to me. My own witness that even it has gone to every village nowadays.
Maybe I'll take it from here, Shreya. For me, I have to say, like, one of the most amazing things I've seen is that, and humbling in a way, is that despite all the research that people might have put in some topics, we don't know enough, like, to really control and actually analyze these things properly. My example was with the fish that I mentioned earlier. So when I grew up, of course, there was like a completely set of fish in my home waters that I grew up fishing in. And then like by the time I was 25 to 30, that had already changed. And by the time I was 35, like 10 years later, had already changed again. So there's been a lot of changes. And one of those changes has been those fishes that were put in the water to graze the weeds, and they were believed not to be able to reproduce at all because in their host system, in their home systems. They have completely different set of conditions, and they were just say like, well, they can't reproduce here. That's for sure. And fair enough, actually, we proved that they are reproducing. So, there's been things that people that study these species for years and have made experiments and such thought completely impossible. But nature has this kind of way of like surprising us and like finding a way. We, in some experiments with the US colleagues, we tried to basically tie up the reproductive ducts of these species, and they are able to regrow the reproductive duct. It's like there's like such an urge from nature to conquer and expand and like continue that it's hard for us to comprehend and like hard for us to estimate properly. So I think my take from this is that there's a lot of changes happening. A lot of more changes will happen in the future, even faster, and that expect the unexpected because things are not as linear as we think.
Yeah. But I think both of you had quite similar experiences when it came to finding like not finding the fishes that you used to see during when you were like younger in your native places and being replaced by exotic fishes. And we during the session we discussed about what are the effects and how we identify them. And now you have worked in this field for few years now. And what do you think is the way ahead in invasive species and research management? I'll first give the question to Dr. Umpathy and then followed by Marco.
Yeah. Actually, it's not single way out for anything. Researcher can only tell where are the fishes, how one can use to assess their presence, absence. But as you previously mentioned, we need to have all the stakeholders come together and find out what the possible ways and means to control them, manage them, and educate them, the public, so that they can do it. In fact, we had a consultative meeting recently last year we had where we invited Biodiversity Authority, Fisheries Board people, and aquaculture people, farmers, journalists, scientists, students in our CCMB here. And we had a very extensive meeting how this we go about, what are the policies one can do it. In fact, we formulated and even circulated to the government as well as what are the future plans like that we are given. In fact, that we published recently current science also. You can find them. But basically, it need to be multi-dimensional. Every stakeholder, there will be people have to educate, people have to make awareness, and people have to control the species. And the government also come forward to control them by way of catching them, telling the farmer, hey, don't do it. There are still some illegal farming going on in some part of India where this meat is used for some other purposes, not eating. So that strict control, although we have some legislation that can stop them actually doing practice of this culture, but still that not been implemented. That need to be implemented. More awareness, maybe citizen science are also required to actually pass on the message to all the people there so that aware, hey, this is a species which need to be taken over from wetland whenever you see them. That kind of multi-dimensional approach is required to actually really control. We need to control immediately. That's my way of doing it.
Right. I mean, the citizen scientist approach is a very interesting approach which hasn't been taken yet, I think, as we were mentioning. I'll give the floor to Marco to for his comments on this.
Thanks, and sorry, I had like somebody calling me three times. So I had to tell them I'm still in the seminar. Look, I'm actually largely sharing the opinion of Dr. Umpathy. What I think is going to happen is that we are going to come up with better techniques for analysis. I know Dr. Umpathy has been like active in that field. We are going to be able to measure things better and come up with different experimental setups, we'll have longer time series of higher quality data to work on with new analysis techniques. And we will be able to shed a bit more light on this issue. So we will detect more species, we will be able to know better what their effects are. And I unfortunately have to say that that will probably be still very challenging for us, that there is no silver bullet, technological or otherwise, that will actually allow us to really solve the problem once and for all. Some of these things are just a mirage for the moment, which doesn't mean that we shouldn't continue working on them, of course, but it also means that the solutions probably are already available for management. It is just a matter of willingness many times. Some of these things can be done at really literally no cost for the public, maybe just benefits, and they can be controlled and managed much better. So my hope is not like just a forecast, it's just perhaps a hope at this stage, is that the management agencies, governmental or otherwise, that are charged with managing the environment will actually employ better tools that are already available to manage the problems better. Because there's a side of research and information that has produced a wealth of information. But my feeling is that a lot of that information hasn't actually been translated into management practice.
Yeah. Thank you both for your thoughts on this particular question. Our time is almost running out, so I am going to take a few questions from the audience, and there are like we will be able to only take two or three because we are almost at the 1 hour limit. And so the first question is from Preetham S. Uh, he is asking, do you think involvement of local communities and taxonomists will be effective in either identification of and reporting mechanism or control of or preventing entry of obnoxious invasive species into respective habitats? And I think Dr. Umpathy was also suggesting something like this. So, yeah, Mako, could you give us your thoughts on this?
Yes, I am absolutely 100% agreeing with the question that definitely those local communities need to be involved, and they are like the front line. I mean, they're the ones that have the most stake in their local environment, and they will be able to prevent and control more effectively than others. Self-policing is the best policing. Sometimes when directives are emanated by a central government, people will just oppose them or not comply with them just because, they're anti-government. But if it's a grassroots movement, if it is like something that is very well felt at the local level, that means more voluntary work, more, spirit and resources being poured by the individuals. I think that's where, people will have to start caring about their environment enough to take direct action and to take more involvement in this. Thanks. Thanks for the question. It was very good.
Right. I think Dr. Ummavati, you were also saying that you had a multi-stakeholder meeting. Does this point also come up during your meeting?
Yeah, we discussed all this point, how one can use like that. In fact, it was discussed, and we also have some solution for that. We had documented this, how one can go about even involving local stakeholders, especially fishermen, because they are at the end of the day, they are going to get affected in the future. And also local village fishermen, they're not regular. Actually, fishermen which they once in a while they catch a fish. These fellow going to be really affected. So we need to have such a wide range of stakeholders in different level of things who get affected. That's what we propose to that in the action plan. Yeah.
Right. So our next question is from Aishwarya. She asks, this question is for Marco. I think when you were talking about the positive impacts of some of the positive impacts of uh, these invasive species, she asks, but do you really think fishing or eating the invasive blue crabs is a way to manage their populations? Because once introduced into market is done, there is no going back.
Yeah, I agree. It's a double-edged sword, of course. But when it comes to blue crab, the blue crabs are eating the mussels that are being farmed, and therefore they collapsed already an industry. There is, at the beginning, no market and no appetite for a new species, which is unfamiliar to people. And therefore, the only way for controlling the population is massive government spending to finance management programs, which are also very likely to fail, because with species like crabs, the production is so massive that it's hard to drive them to extinction, even locally. So I think it's a very double-edged sword. However, if done right, again, it's like a self-sustaining mechanism that doesn't cost the government a lot. It's basically promoting the consumption so that the fishing pressure is sufficient to drive a management control of the species at the local level. As you know, of course, the market will perish if the species is really driven to extinction. But what I'm trying to underline here is that there are other species that the fishermen can sell once this is driven to extinction. And humans have been very good at driving species to extinction. So we're really, really good at fishing. We can get a lot of fish. So if we could basically drive that kind of fishing pressure to a species that is undesirable, and that we can say, well, fish as much as you can, I think that's positive. It redirects pressure from other species that are more sensitive and we want to conserve to a species that we want to just exploit to the maximum. Will we be able like that to actually control and extinguish these species? I mean, no, possibly. That's not possible. Most of cases, once the density of the population goes beyond a certain threshold, it's not commercially economically viable anymore to fish them, so the fishermen will switch to something else. But that said, that's when actually the funds of the government might actually keep alive a containment program and say, oh, keep on fishing these species. We'll subsidize you for a while because we are actually so close to driving them to extinction. And I mean, potentially this works, and it only works, unfortunately, when there's a market, the market is viable, and the subsidies, if any, are available. And there's also, I think, a socioeconomic opening to doing something like this, which is sometimes it's hard. So I understand that was like a case that I mentioned in my talk, which might be clearer than others because the species is actually pretty good to eat. But I think that we need to find very new creative way to engage the population and the existing sectors like fishing, hunting, and such in the control of invasive species through, of course, supervision of the government, and to not have any phenomenon like illegal fishing and such. But right, I think the role of the government is redirecting these pressures and managing the environment so that we apply pressure on species that are not desirable, and we are relieving at the same time species that are more desirable for us to be there. Thanks. I hope this helped. It was a very long and very wide explanation.
No, I mean, I think it's a debate which needs a longer explanation as well. So I think a lot of our discussion is going towards the socioeconomic part of it as well. Like while we know that invasive species are one of the biggest threats to biodiversity at this point, but a lot of during our discussions, we delve into the importance or how it affects people as well. So the next question is for both Dr. Mapati and Marco. So they ask, as exotic species can disrupt local fisheries, how harmful is that to economy of the communities who depend on the fishing?
So we have no data as of now in India, especially the aquatic invasive species impact on local fishes as of now. But the people are saying that their economy is declined because of some invasive species, but we have no data as of now in India. That need to be taken out before we discuss about that. But otherwise, there's a feeling that this species over more and more species get declined because of invasive. As I mentioned just now, my village, we got all the fishes, only this invasive species. That's a simple example. In Hyderabad, in my city, where other 10 lakhs it has its presence, means a lot. So we don't know how much impact economically. That need to be very objectively assessed long period of time and getting a lot of data required. As of now, in India, I don't think anybody assessed as of now.
You.
Yeah, I'm not as clear. Can you restate your question, please? Like I was
Yes,
a bit confused.
sure. So this person basically asks, how harmful is are the exotic species to economy
Okay,
of the
yeah, I got
communities
it.
who depend?
I got it. Thanks. It depends a lot, and so there is no, they can be potentially very helpful, as Dr. Umpathy has said, and I totally agree with him. And then they can be having almost no consequence at all. And this, the type of damage is like very variable. Like, I mean, local communities normally, especially subsistence communities, they tend to harvest no matter what the species. So as long as the new species are, for example, edible, that's not a much of a disruption. You might change one species with another, but it can, not have a lot of consequences. However, I think there's a very clear case and very famous one in Lake Victoria in South Africa, where they have introduced the Nile perch, which is native to other parts of Africa, and that has displaced the local rural traditional fisheries, which were focused on cyclids, so a smaller species that were predated by the bigger, larger species. And yet, of course, the rural communities didn't have a mean to switch to the new type of fish that lived deeper, was bigger, so you needed different gear, you need different fishing practices. So, and those local rural fisheries suffered a lot, and they are subsistence fisheries, so people suffered. People, starved, literally starved. So I think we should just not forget that these changes, sometimes they seem to be negligible or like some, just sport recreational fishing, but the aquatic ecosystem does provide a lot of ecosystem services on many of subsistence level, and changing some of these things might have a very big impact on the local rural populations. Sometimes, again, it's possible to change the protein from one species with the protein from another one. You used to cultivate mussels and now you harvest blue crabs, but other times these are not the same thing, and people cannot adapt, and therefore like people will actually have a very large impact, socioeconomic and sometimes a subsistence level. Thanks.
Right. I will just follow up with a small question and then we will wrap it. So, as Dr. Umapati was also saying that it is a loss that we know of, but haven't measured it properly as of yet. Are you aware of any instances where people have been able to measure the loss, the economic loss the local community has incurred because of invasive species?
To me,
Uh, yes, I mean, this is to both Marco and you. Are you aware of any studies where they have looked at the actual economic loss which has been incurred by the communities?
My knowledge limited. It was not much available because the invasiveness all recently, that last 40, 50 years, that is not much studies happening now. Only we all know that the present substance, but there's no economic evaluation of this loss. As he mentioned, cichlids, one of the typical example, classical example where this Nile perch replaced the entire system. So that's the one very fantastic example.
I see.
When it comes to me, yes, I'm aware of many studies. There's a whole branch of ecology that tries to, how do I put this diplomatically without offending anyone, put a price tag on things, therefore trying to estimate what the value of things is in terms, sometimes in economic terms. And I'm not trying to disparage, but like this methodology sometimes involves asking people like, how much do you value? You know, what's the value you would put on, let's say, an iconic species like a seal or something that, of course, unfortunately leads to the fact that people like seals more than they like shrimp or fish, and therefore, that's kind of skews a bit the valuation. But they will try to assess the economy, for example, created by species, by surveys. They will make inquiries and like estimate, I don't know, how many anglers are willing to spend money to go and fish these new species. And I think what you would see if you looked at the literature in a very broad view is that the results are quite influenced as well, like from the disposition of the researchers. So it's hard to give like a very estimate, but I can certainly say it's possible to, and there are methods, whether they're uniform or not, to try and estimate these losses. And they have been like pursued many times because in some countries like the US, economic loss quantification is part of declaring a species invasive or not. And a species being declared invasive or not, just not only introduced but also invasive, has consequences in the way that the states or the Federation of States measure that species and how many funds are available to contain or manage the species. So I think this is part of the definition of invasiveness in general, and that is being like quite a challenging definition, all in all, where there's a socioeconomic component, but there are specialized scientists that really do only this, and they try to estimate the socioeconomic loss, and but as again, like in a bad way, maybe, but a price tag on what has been lost and what has been gained. And I think it's particularly useful when talking with politicians because they are very much receptive to this kind of arguments. Thanks.
I see. Thank you. Thank you, Marco. Thank you, Dr. Umpathy, for joining us and engaging in this discussion and giving us anecdotes from your field and experiences. And I would like to thank the audience for joining us and listening and participating in this discussion. And yeah. If anything else from Marco and Dr. Umpathy, and then we will end the meeting.
Look, I just wanted to thank everyone for listening to me boringly talk for so long time. I really appreciate you coming to this meeting and webinar, and I hope that you walk away with something more like a different perspective. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Shreya, for inviting us to have such a wonderful discussion with Marco. Appreciate it. And this needs a lot of awareness that you initiated. And we are going to have a similar program in all India level, which I'm going to make awareness program on invasive species. It will help spread this message. And thank you very much, one and all. If anybody have any queries, you can always reach out to me. I can help to address them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Marco. Thank you, Dr. Umpathy. So, I would like to give a little bit introduction about the CWS Wildlife Chronicles. So basically, we used to host a lot of talks in our office, but we want to have a wider spread and wider array of people from different backgrounds, which whom we can involve in our talks and have different kind of topics, such as the one that we are having today on aquatic invasive species, which is a very interesting topic and a very important one given the different kind of water bodies that we are dependent on.